The Rutledge estate did not sit upon the earth so much as it seemed to sink into it, a heavy, brooding thing of blackened timber and stone that had soured the soil for miles around. For 100 years, the iron gates had grown open only to let a Rutledge in, and never to let one out. The townspeople of Woodson whispered that the air inside those walls was recycled, breathed over and over again by the same set of lungs, just as the blood in their veins was cycled through the same stagnant pool. They said a Rutledge daughter was born with a ring on her finger, already betrothed to a cousin, a second cousin, or an uncle, binding the family circle so tight that it strangled the life out of anyone who tried to breathe freely. Purity, the elders called it. Preservation. But to the birds that refused to fly over the manor's crooked gables, it smelled only of our OT.IT began with Silas Rutledge, a man whose shadow seemed to stretch longer than his body, casting a pall over the valley long before the walls were fully erected against the world. The year was 1892, a year the crops turned gray in the fields and the river ran unusually low, exposing the skeletal roots of the cypress trees like grasping fingers. Silas had been watching his kin for years, noting with a clinical, horrified fascination that the Rutledge line did not age so much as it stiffened. They were like leather left too long in the sun, tough, unyielding, and unnaturally enduring. His own father had lived to be 110, ranting at invisible phantoms until the very hour his heart simply forgot to beat, his face unlined but his eyes filled with a century of accumulated madness. Silas realized then that what the locals whispered about as good fortune was, in truth, a malignancy of the blood, a vitality so aggressive it consumed the mind to feed the flesh. He convened the family in the library, a room that smelled of damp wool and burning wick. The storm outside battered the stained glass, but the silence inside was absolute. Silas stood before the hearth, the firelight dancing across his face, revealing the terrible burden of his revelation. He held the family Bible, not to preach from it, but to close it forever. He told them that the Rutledge blood was a venom that could not be diluted, for to mix it with the thin, fleeting blood of outsiders was to invite catastrophe. He had seen what happened when the line strayed. Children born with eyes too old for their faces, minds that cracked under the weight of genetic memory before they could even speak. The gift, as he called it with a sneer that twisted his mustache, was a fire that had to be kept in the hearth. Let it spread to the curtains, and the whole house would burn. That night, the covenant was struck, not with ink, but with a terrified acquiescence. The decree was absolute. The Rutledge name would curl back upon itself like a serpent eating its tail. No stranger would ever walk the halls as a spouse. No outside blood would ever pollute the sacred, stagnant pool of their lineage. They would marry cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, tightening the knot until the family tree was a single, gnarled trunk with no branches reaching for the light. Silas looked at his daughters, their faces pale and identical in the dim light, and sentenced them to a life of incestuous preservation, convincing them that the world outside was too fragile to hold them, that they were gods in the making, bound by a terrible, divine duty to keep their divinity contained within the iron gates. The doors were bolted, the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the moon, and the isolation began, turning the estate into a pressure cooker where time pooled in the corners and sanity began to curdle like milk left out in the heat for 3 generations. The perimeter held as if the very air around the Rutledge estate had curdled into a physical barrier, repelling the curious and the lost alike. But rot, by its very nature, begins at the edges, and Alara was the fissure in the foundation that Silas had never predicted. She was the youngest of the current brood, born with the same pale, translucent skin as her sisters, yet possessing a restlessness that the heavy, velvet-draped halls could not stifle. While her kin were content to sit in the parlor and reread the same dusty journals of their ancestors, Alara haunted the property lines, pressing her face against the rusted iron gates, inhaling the scent of pine and wet earth that drifted from the forbidden Woodson lands. It was on a Tuesday, suffocatingly humid and thick with gnats, when the isolation finally fractured. Elias, a man of maps and brass instruments, had come to redraw the county lines, unaware that he was stepping on a soil that did not wish to be measured. He stood knee-deep in the fern-choked gully that marked the edge of the Rutledge Clan, his tripod sunk into the soft mud, trying to make sense of geography that seemed to shift when he looked away. When he looked up, he found her watching him not from behind the gate, but standing on a moss-slicked rock on his side of the creek. In the harsh light of the afternoon sun, Elara looked less like a woman and more like a porcelain doll left out in the rain. Fragile, out of place, and terrifyingly beautiful. Elias should have packed his gear and retreated to the safety of the town, but he was a man of logic who did not believe in the superstitions of the locals. He saw only a girl in a dress cut from a fashion 20 years out of date, her eyes wide with a hunger he mistook for curiosity. He spoke to her, his voice ringing out with a clarity that shattered the oppressive silence of the woods, and for the first time in her life, Elara heard a sound that wasn't an echo of her own bloodline. The courtship that followed was a clandestine fever dream, conducted in the shadows of the weeping willows where the estate's influence was weakest. Elias brought her small tokens from the outside world, a newspaper, a ribbon, a handful of wild berries, objects that vibrated with a life force Elara had never known. She, in turn, offered him herself, a vessel of pent-up energy and rebellion. They did not know that the woods were listening, that the wind rustling the leaves carried the scent of their betrayal back to the main house. Elara was not just breaking a rule. She was tearing a hole in the atmospheric pressure that held the Rutledge sanity together. Elias, blinded by the romance of rescuing a trapped princess, failed to see that the rescue was merely the opening of a door that had been barred for a reason, and that by inviting him in, she was not escaping her fate, but merely changing the ingredients of the tragedy. Elias had rehearsed his defense 1,000 times, preparing to dodge buckshot or curses, but when he stood before the Rutledge elders to claim Elara, the resistance he anticipated was absent. It was like pushing against a heavy iron door he expected to be locked, only to fall forward into the dark when it swung open at the slightest touch. They did not shout. They did not invoke the ancient covenant Silas had screamed to the rafters decades prior. Instead, Uncle Malachi, a man whose skin hung off his face like melted wax, merely blinked his milky eyes and gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. The acceptance was too quick, too fluid, sliding into place with the greased precision of a trap mechanism. The date was set not by the couple, but by the family, aligned with some obscure lunar phase that Elias dismissed as eccentric folklore, but which the clan treated with rigid, terrified reverence. When the day arrived, the house seemed to have swallowed the sunlight. There were no guests from Whitson, no fiddlers, no tables laden with roasted meats or flowing wine. The ceremony was held in the great hall, a cavernous space where the dust motes suspended in the air seemed to be the only things moving. The Rutledge kin lined the walls, a silent choir of pale, unblinking witnesses. They wore their Sunday best, but the clothes smelled of cedar chests and stagnation, fabrics that had not seen the light of day since the turn of the century. Elias stood at the altar, a heavy mahogany table that looked suspiciously like a butcher's block, and felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, freezing despite the stifling heat. It was the silence that unnerved him most. A wedding should be a cacophony of whispers and laughter, but here, the only sound was the wet, labored breathing of the elders and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock that sounded like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The officiant was not a priest, but the oldest living Rutledge, a woman named Martha who sat in a wheelchair, her legs covered by a moth-eaten quilt. Her voice was a dry rasp, reciting words that sounded less like a holy union and more like a biological merger. As Elias slipped the ring onto Elara's finger, he looked out at her family, expecting to see grief or resentment for the daughter they were losing. What he saw instead chilled his blood more than hatred ever could. They were leaning forward, their necks craning, their eyes wide and glistening with a rapt, predatory focus. It was not the look of parents giving away a child. It was the look of a starving pack watching a deer step unwittingly into a clearing. They were not looking at Elara at all, but at him, studying his flushed skin, his strong hands, and the pulse visible in his neck with a terrifying, avaricious intensity. The integration of Elias's belongings into the Rutledge estate felt less like moving in and more like the futile piling of driftwood against a rising tide. His brass surveyor's tools, his crisp linen shirts, and his leather-bound novels looked absurdly transient against the backdrop of the house's monolithic gloom, where the furniture seemed rooted into the floorboards by fungal growth. He spent his first week mapping the interior, a habit of his profession he could not shake, trying to impose logic on a floor plan that defied it. Corridors twisted back upon themselves, and staircases ended abruptly at ceiling panels that had been plastered over. But it was the east wing that disrupted his calculations, a spur of the house that jutted out toward the swamp, shrouded in perpetual shadow. The hallway leading to it did not gradually darken. It simply ceased to be lit, the gas lamps sputtering and dying as if the air there lacked the oxygen to sustain them. At the end of this suffocating tunnel stood a door of heavy, iron-banded oak, distinct from the polished mahogany of the other rooms, bearing no handle. Only a heavy sliding bolt secured with a padlock that looked rusted shut, yet the oil around the mechanism was fresh and glistening. When Elias first reached out to touch the cold iron of the bolt, the reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Alara, who had been drifting through the house like a specter in her wedding gown, materialized at his elbow with a grip that bruised. Her voice, usually a melodic whisper, dropped to a frantic hiss as she dragged him away, babbling about structural instability, black mold, and floorboards that had given way years ago. She claimed the wing was condemned, a carcass of the house left to rot, but her eyes darted to the door frame with a look that was not fear of falling, but fear of what might rise. She pulled him back into the light, her trembling hands cold against his skin, making him promise, swear on his life, that he would never attempt to breach that seal. Elias agreed to pacify her, attributing her panic to the eccentric neuroses of her lineage, but the seed of suspicion had been planted in the fertile soil of his unease. Sleep became a stranger to him in that house. The silence of the Rutledge estate was not the absence of noise, but a heavy, listening presence that pressed against his eardrums. It was on the third night, as he lay awake staring at the canopy of the bed that smelled of camphor and old breath, that he heard it. It was not the settling of the house, nor the wind in the eaves. It was a rhythmic, wet scratching, faint but unmistakable, rising through the floorboards from the direction of the forbidden wing. It sounded like fingernails dragging against stone, persistent and desperate, accompanied by a low, mewling vibration that was almost too low for the human ear to register, a sound that suggested something was not merely trapped in the dark, but was methodically, patiently wearing its way out the longer Elias stayed. The more the natural laws he had mapped and measured in the outside world seemed to warp around the Rutledge estate. His surveyor's mind, accustomed to the precise geometry of minutes and miles, found nothing but contradiction. The house was dusty with age, yet the layers of soot on the antique furniture never deepened. It was a static, photographic coating that never accumulated a fresh layer. He tried to wipe a ledge in the library, and the cloth came away clean, as if the particles were suspended in some kind of invisible resin. This lack of change was not cleanliness, it was preservation, and it chilled him far more than any filth could. He tested the anomaly scientifically, leaving a bowl of ripe peaches out on the kitchen counter, expecting the rapid, fungoid bloom of summer decay. After 3 days, the peaches had merely hardened, their color preserved, their flesh ossified into stone, defying the quickening, cyclical rhythm of life and death that governed the world outside the iron gate. The temporal dislocation was most visible in the pantry and the garden, where the seasons seemed to stall. But it was in the parlor that the true horror of stagnant time manifested itself. The elderly Rutledge cousins, always occupying the same high-backed chairs, never seemed to sleep. Elias would often pass the parlor door in the dead of night, expecting to find the room empty and shrouded in shadow, but the fire would always be banked low, casting long, wavering shapes, and they would be there, sitting, their eyes open, their faces placid and unmoving, fixed on a point just beyond the edge of his vision. They did not read or converse or shift their weight, possessing the inert stillness of mannequins. Once, he watched Great Aunt Cecily for an hour, convinced she was already dead, only for her to slowly, deliberately blink once, the dry sound of her eyelid disturbing the profound silence like a shot. He began to keep track of the clocks, of which the house had dozens, each ticking with frantic individuality. Yet the time they kept seemed irrelevant. The sun rose and set, but the heavy, oppressive miasma inside never dissipated, a perpetual afternoon that smelled of old wood and mothballs, locking the inhabitants into an unending, unnerving present. Elias felt the quick energy draining from his limbs, replaced by a slow, heavy lethargy. The house was not aging gracefully. It was defying the very concept of aging, preserving itself and its inhabitants in a state of eternal, agonizing half-life. And he was beginning to feel that same unnatural permanence seep into his own bones, the unsettling stagnation of time and the persistent scratching from the forbidden east wing finally shattered Elias's remaining rational defenses. He stopped looking for structural explanations and began searching for history, convinced that the house held its own memory locked within its walls. He returned to the library, a room of profound stillness where the very paper of the books felt brittle with unspoken secrets. His methodical search eventually paid off in the deepest corner, behind a long-forgotten folio of Puritan sermons, a mechanism that yielded a hollow thud and slid open a concealed panel in the wainscoting. Inside, nestled on a shelf lined with desiccated velvet, lay a single, massive ledger, bound in thick, scarred leather that seemed to absorb the light. The title embossed on the spine was simply the Chronicle of Containment, and its pages were filled with the meticulous, spidery handwriting of generations of patriarchs. It was not a celebratory family tree. It was a horrifying document of genetic control. The first few pages were terrifyingly stark, showing the lineage looping and folding back upon itself, arrows pointing backward to names already inked out, forming a dense, repetitive tapestry. But Elias's hands began to shake when he reached the sections dedicated to the anomalies. These were the short, violent flares in the family history where a Rutledge had dared to marry an outsider. The entries were clinical and cold. Elias read the name of a distant cousin, Margaret, who married a man named Pendergast in 1910. Beside Pendergast's name, the chronicler had scribbled the devastating consequence: the bloom, loss of containment, subject required removal. The chilling implication was clear. The incestuous marriage was not a status symbol or a dedication to a twisted ideal of purity, but a desperate, pragmatic necessity. It was a centuries-old attempt to dilute a persistent, terrifying genetic flaw, a flaw that introduced itself as a physical or mental recurrence whenever a foreign, healthy set of genes was introduced, as if the Rutledge blood viewed fresh stock as a catalyst for eruption. The constant marrying of cousins was a way to keep the line genetically inert, to ensure the gift remained dormant and subdued. The outside blood did not refresh the line. It agitated it, ensuring that the next generation would be born with the terrifying visible manifestation of the curse that Silas had feared. Elias looked at his own name, recently and neatly added to the ledger, followed by a small, ominous, bracketed question mark, and he understood with horrifying clarity why they had let him in so easily. He wasn't a suitor. He was an experiment, a biological reagent thrown into their decaying test tubulars. Confirmation of the pregnancy felt less like a celebration and more like the tolling of a great, inevitable bell. For Elias, holding his wife's hand, the news was not a wonder but a terror, a direct and catastrophic fulfillment of the curse foretold in the Chronicle of Containment. The elders reacted instantly, their previous indifference dissolving into an alarming, singular obsession. The air of quiet neglect that had defined the house was instantly replaced by a stifling, claustrophobic surveillance. Elias found himself relegated to the periphery of the household, suddenly treated not as a husband, but as a dangerous, contaminating element that had completed its unfortunate biological function. The old women of the clan, the pallid, silent aunts who had previously only watched him with that hungry curiosity, now moved their sentinel chairs directly into the hallway outside the couple's chambers. They sat in shifts, their brittle, dried-out figures constantly alert, their gaze fixed on Alara's closed door. She was no longer permitted to leave the room for fear that the slightest upset might agitate the confluence. As Uncle Malachi cryptically put it, when Elias was finally permitted brief, supervised visits, he found his wife surrounded by relics, strange, dark-colored woven baskets, shallow bowls filled with murky tinctures that smelled of copper and swamp water, and ancient, heavy quilts embroidered with incomprehensible symbols. The atmosphere was thick with low, humming recitations, unintelligible chants whispered in a Rutledge dialect so archaic that even Alara did not understand the words. The terror was in the complete absence of familial joy. They did not touch Alara's belly with affection. They touched it with the fierce, protective vigilance of guards securing a dangerously unstable reactor. They fed her rich, strange meals based on recipes found in the ledger, designed not for nourishment, but for biological manipulation, preparing the vessel for the terrible potential it carried. Elias realized with a crushing horror that they weren't protecting her from harm. They were protecting her for the event, determined to ensure that the introduction of his outside blood, the fertilizer, would yield the exact, monstrous recurrence that Silas Rutledge had first observed generations ago. They were thrilled, in their silent, chilling way, because the moment of truth, the culmination of their experiment in genetic horror, was finally upon them. He could hear them now, just outside the door, their dry whispers never ceasing, murmuring their archaic prayers over the blood that would soon spill and finally reveal the truth of the Rutledge gift. The change in Elias was not the quick drama of an infection, but the slow, calculated dismantling of a strong constitution. It began with an intractable, bone-deep weariness that the oppressive, stagnant air of the manor seemed to amplify. His robust color faded to a sallow, sickly gray, and the persistent chill in his limbs mocked the sweltering southern climate. The sickness was evasive, mimicking a common fever one day and profound spiritual exhaustion the next, yet it was absolutely unrelenting. His hands, once steady enough to trace precise lines on a map, began to shake faintly, and his surveyor's instruments felt impossibly heavy when he attempted to touch them. He tried to eat, but the rich, ancient food prepared in the Rutledge kitchen, which somehow never spoiled, offered him no sustenance. It tasted of ash and copper, passing through him without nourishing his strength. The horror was compounded by the terrifying contrast he presented to the Rutledge kin. While he, a man in his prime, deteriorated like a piece of fresh meat left exposed, the elders maintained their terrifying, unchanging stiffness. They observed his decline with the detached interest of scientists watching a petri dish. No one offered a remedy. No one expressed concern. They only provided the dark, metallic water drawn from the deep estate well and the food from their preserved stores. Elias grew paranoid, scrutinizing every glass of water, certain the family was slowly poisoning him. But the truth was more insidious and far more terrifying. The house itself was the poison. The containment field that Silas Rutledge had established generations ago was now actively rejecting the foreign element that dared to cross the threshold. The unnatural permanence of the estate, which preserved furniture and prevented food decay, was now leaching the vitality from him. The blood that the family had sought to contain was actively fighting his strength, his youth, the very vigor they had hoped would shock their lineage back into health, was being systematically extracted by the malignant will of the manor. Elias realized his marriage had been less an experiment in genetics and more a form of bizarre, biological sequestration. He was not being allowed to thrive or even die quickly. He was being slowly neutralized, reduced to a hollow, compliant shell whose blood would no longer pose a threat to the bloom now growing in Alara's womb, ensuring that when the time came, the only functioning vital force in the room would be the dreadful one. The Rutledge family was patiently waiting for Elias had no time for convincing Alara. His failing strength and the quickening arrival of the child demanded immediate action. The realization, drawn from the cold pages of the ledger, was hammered home by the ceaseless, silent vigil of the elders. They were prisoners waiting for a horrible delivery. They chose the darkest night possible, a tempest that drowned the valley in a deafening downpour, hoping the wind and the thunder would mask the creak of the front door and the rapid pounding of their hearts. Elias, feverish and leaning heavily on Alara, guided them past the parlor where the fires still glowed low, casting the unnaturally still forms of his captors in dancing, mocking shadows. They made it past the threshold, the rush of cold, cleansing rain momentarily reviving Elias's senses. They ran down the long, moss-slicked drive, away from the bulk of the house, Alara gripping his arm, her fear overcome by the desperate will to survive. The plan was simple, reach the perimeter fence, slip through the rusted gully where they first met, and follow the county road to Woodson. They found the main gates, those rusted sentinels of the Covenant, and pushed through the heavy iron, tasting freedom for a desperate, fleeting moment. They followed the muddy track beyond the Rutledge grounds, walking until their muscles screamed and the soles of their shoes were caked with clay. They passed a recognizable grouping of 3 ancient, split oaks, landmarks Elias knew lay 2 miles from the house. They walked for what felt like another full hour, the path winding and dark, the rain washing away any sense of direction save the downward slope of the terrain. Elias felt a surge of hope, certain they had put insurmountable distance between themselves and the house, when Alara suddenly stopped, clutching his arm so tightly her nails broke the skin. Ahead of them, emerging from the sheets of rain like a terrifying, familiar vision, stood the same grouping of 3 ancient, split oaks. Panic, cold and nauseating, seized them. They turned, running desperately in the opposite direction, trying to backtrack to the gate, only to find the path confusingly blocked by thickets they had never seen before. They fought through the clinging brush, blinded by the rain, until they finally broke free onto an open drive, a stretch of familiar, paved road. But the relief curdled in their throats, for directly before them, heavy and imposing under the violent lightning flashes, stood the familiar, sullen silhouette of the Rutledge mansion, its dark windows staring down at them with terrifying, silent comprehension. The house had not let them leave. The land itself was bound to the Covenant, having simply folded the path. Bringing the lost sheep back to the pen. The exhaustion from the failed escape attempt was the final blow to Elias's already broken constitution. He was dragged back into the manor just as Alara's labor began, the sounds of her pain muffled by the heavy drapes, but amplified by the fear in his heart. The elders did not bother to lock him in. His fever now raged so high he was barely capable of crawling. They permitted him to lie on a cot near Alara's bed, knowing his vitality was spent and his will broken. The focus was entirely on the delivery, the culmination of the bloom that their outside blood had catalyzed. The old women gathered, chanting their unintelligible litany, their eyes fixed on Alara with an unbearable, expectant greed. As the hours passed and Alara's screams intensified, Elias felt his own body failing completely. The room swam, the shadows deepened, and the cold that had been in his limbs finally crept into his center. He was no longer sick, he was dissolving. His last flicker of clarity was the terrifying realization of the truth that transcended the ledger. The outsiders didn't just die. Their unique vitality was captured. The constant, unnatural stiffness of the Rutledge elders, the feeling that time had stopped. That was the sustained result of previous victims whose life force and consciousness were now fused with the house's malignant will. The scratching from the east wing was not a monster trying to get out. It was the restless, trapped spirit of the last outsider who had married in, forever trying to scratch through the wall. He was not intended to be a father who would be cast out, but a new, vital component of the mansion's containment field. His physical body was becoming one of the perpetual, unmoving presences in the parlor, another silent watcher, his consciousness bound to the walls to help sustain the unnatural stasis of the house. Just as Alara let out a final, raw cry, signaling the birth, Elias felt a cold, magnetic force pulled down from his head, through his chest, and into the floorboards beneath him. His vision blurred, the faces of the elders, silent, victorious, stretched and warped as his own perspective shifted, becoming wider, colder, encompassing the room, the hallway, the east wing, and the deep, silent well. The final sounds he registered were Alara's broken sobbing and the first, thin, unsettling cry of the new baby, a sound that did not promise innocence, but confirmed the monstrous success of the experiment, a sound that he would hear, echoing in the darkness, for the terrifying, endless duration of his absorption into the fabric of the Rutledge house.